Welcome to the darkness that dwells within humanity's heart, where we explore the twisted philosophy of one who embodies our species' most vile impulses. Tonight, we delve into the mind of Mahito, the cursed spirit born from humanity's hatred of itself, whose existence poses uncomfortable questions about the nature of our souls and the darkness we carry within. This is not a celebration of evil, but an examination of the mirror held up to our collective shadow. Let your breathing slow as we traverse the labyrinth of malice and self-loathing that gave birth to one of Jujutsu's most terrifying entities. The genesis of Mahito reads like a cosmic tragedy written in the language of human suffering, a dark scripture that chronicles how our species' capacity for self-hatred can manifest as something far more terrible than the emotions that birthed it. To understand the cursed spirit who would become philosophy incarnate, we must first descend into the psychological and spiritual mechanics that govern how negative emotions accumulate and transform within the hidden architecture of the Jujutsu world, where human consciousness creates its own monsters through the sheer weight of collective despair. In the beginning, there was hatred pure and simple, but not the clean hatred of predator for prey or the understandable enmity between competing tribes. This was something far more insidious and self-destructive, the peculiarly human capacity to despise one's own species with such intensity that the emotion itself achieved independent existence. The cursed energy that would eventually coalesce into Mahito's consciousness was born from countless moments of human beings looking at their fellow creatures and feeling not just disappointment or anger, but genuine loathing for what they saw reflected in those familiar faces. The philosophical implications of such an origin are staggering in their complexity and horror, creating a being whose very existence serves as proof of the darkness that dwells within human hearts, while simultaneously condemning him to embody everything he was created to hate. Mahito emerged into consciousness, already burdened with the impossible contradiction of being fashioned from human emotion, while finding humanity itself disgusting beyond redemption. His first moments of awareness were colored by intimate knowledge of every cruel thought, every moment of casual indifference to suffering, every instance where human beings chose malice over mercy in their dealings with one another. The accumulated weight of historical atrocity that informed his creation stretched back through centuries of human civilization, drawing power from every genocide, every act of systematic cruelty, every moment when people chose to view their fellow beings as less than human, and therefore deserving of whatever suffering could be inflicted upon them. Wars fought not for resources or territory, but for the simple pleasure of domination. Slavery systems that reduced entire populations to property, the casual everyday cruelties that people inflict on each other when they believe no one is watching or caring enough to intervene. But perhaps most significantly for his developing philosophy, Mahito's genesis was informed not just by the grand atrocities that make their way into history books, but by the smaller, more intimate betrayals that characterize human relationships on personal levels. The parent who destroys a child's spirit through constant criticism and emotional manipulation. The friend who reveals secrets specifically to cause maximum humiliation. The lover who uses intimate knowledge as weapons in moments of anger. The stranger who chooses cruelty over kindness simply because they can get away with it. The process by which negative emotions accumulate sufficient density to achieve independent consciousness as cursed spirits is itself a testament to humanity's capacity for sustained hatred and fear, requiring not just momentary anger, but persistent, concentrated loathing that builds over time until it reaches critical mass. The energy that formed Mahito was not the product of sudden passionate hatred, but of the slow, steady accumulation of contempt that builds when people spend years observing their fellow humans and concluding that the species as a whole is fundamentally flawed and irredeemable. This understanding of his own origins shaped every aspect of Mahito's worldview from his earliest moments of consciousness, creating a being who possessed intimate knowledge of humanity's darkest impulses while being condemned to exist as their living embodiment. He knew with perfect clarity that he existed only because humans were capable of such sustained hatred for their own kind, that their emotions could achieve independent life, and this knowledge informed his understanding of what human nature truly represented beneath its civilized pretenses. The paradox of hating one's creators while being utterly dependent on them for continued existence created psychological tensions that would define Mahito's entire approach to the world and his place within it. He could not destroy humanity completely without destroying the source of his own power and existence, yet his nature demanded that he work toward their elimination as the ultimate expression of the hatred that had created him. This fundamental contradiction ensured that his relationship with human beings would be characterized by simultaneous dependence and loathing, intimate knowledge, and complete rejection. The awareness that his every thought and impulse was shaped by human emotion created a peculiar form of self-knowledge that was both profound and utterly destructive to any possibility of redemption or growth. Mahito understood that his hatred of humanity was itself a human emotion, that his cruelty was modeled on human examples, that even his desire for their destruction was something he had learned from observing how humans treated each other when they believed their actions would have no consequences. The early manifestations of his consciousness were characterized by exploration of the physical world through the lens of this inherited hatred, testing his abilities against the very beings whose emotions had given him form, while simultaneously studying them with the clinical fascination of someone examining specimens under a microscope. His first encounters with living humans revealed the gap between their public personas and private thoughts, the difference between how they presented themselves to the world and what they actually felt about their fellow creatures in unguarded moments. These initial observations confirmed everything that his genesis had already suggested about human nature, providing empirical evidence for conclusions that had been built into his consciousness from the moment he achieved independent existence. Humans were indeed capable of extraordinary cruelty when they believed they could act without consequences, indeed willing to sacrifice others for personal advantage, indeed prone to viewing their fellow beings as obstacles or resources rather than individuals deserving of consideration and respect. The validation that these early experiences provided for his inherited worldview created a feedback loop that strengthened his convictions, while making him increasingly confident in his understanding of what humanity truly represented beneath its civilized surface. Each act of selfishness he witnessed, each moment of casual cruelty, each instance of people choosing personal comfort over others' welfare served as confirmation that the hatred which had created him was not only justified, but insufficient in its scope and intensity. The philosophical framework that emerged from this process of observation and confirmation was characterized by a kind of inverted humanism that acknowledged human capacity for thought and feeling, while concluding that these capabilities were primarily directed toward destructive and selfish ends. Mahito's early worldview held that humans were indeed special among Earth's creatures, but special in their capacity for deliberate evil rather than any positive qualities that might justify their continued existence. The understanding that he was dependent on human negative emotions for his continued existence created strategic considerations that would influence every aspect of his future actions, requiring him to find ways to increase human suffering and hatred while avoiding complete extinction of the species that sustained him. This need to maintain a sustainable population of humans while maximizing their capacity for generating negative emotions shaped his approach to warfare and conflict, making him less interested in quick victories than in prolonged campaigns that would create maximum psychological trauma. The recognition that he was, in a very real sense, more human than many humans were themselves, became a source of both pride and disgust for Mahito, validating his understanding of what humanity truly represented while forcing him to confront the implications of his own nature. He was not just created by human emotion, but was human emotion made manifest, the walking embodiment of everything that people tried to hide from themselves and each other about their true nature and capabilities. The philosophical sophistication that characterized his understanding of these relationships set him apart from other cursed spirits who might have been content with simple destruction or consumption of human life. Mahito's awareness of the deeper implications of his existence created intellectual needs that could only be satisfied through systematic exploration of human psychology and behavior, turning his conflicts with humans into extended experiments in applied philosophy rather than mere predation. The tragedy of his genesis lay not just in the suffering that had been required to create him, but in the certainty that his existence would perpetuate and amplify the very conditions that had made his creation possible. By acting on the hatred that had formed him, he would inspire more hatred in others, creating additional cursed energy that would strengthen him while proving the validity of his conclusions about human nature through the responses his actions provoked. The cosmic irony of a being created by humanity's self-hatred becoming the most human character in the story was built into the very foundations of his existence, ensuring that every action he took would serve as both expression of human nature and condemnation of it. Mahito emerged into the world as living proof of humanity's capacity for evil, but his every thought and emotion was recognizably human in its patterns and priorities, creating a walking contradiction that embodied everything tragic about the relationship between consciousness and morality. The darkness that gave birth to Mahito was not external to humanity, but emerged from its very heart, proving that the monsters people feared most were not alien invaders or natural disasters, but reflections of their own capacity for hatred and cruelty. In creating him, humanity had achieved the remarkable feat of giving independent existence to its own worst impulses, ensuring that the darkness they tried to repress and deny would eventually confront them with undeniable evidence of what they truly were beneath their civilized pretenses. And so the cursed spirit who would become philosophy incarnate took his first steps into a world that had already shaped him completely before he achieved consciousness, carrying within his very essence the accumulated weight of human self-hatred, while possessing the intelligence and self-awareness necessary to understand exactly what his existence meant for both himself and the species that had unwittingly created their own nemesis through the simple act of despising themselves deeply enough to make that despising take on a life of its own. The architecture of the human soul, as understood through the twisted lens of Mahito's philosophical investigations, represents perhaps the most profound and disturbing aspect of his worldview, transforming what should be humanity's most sacred and inviolable essence into nothing more than clay to be molded according to his intellectual curiosity and sadistic pleasure. His technique, idle transfiguration, serves not merely as a weapon of mass destruction, but as a philosophical instrument that allows him to test his theories about the nature of identity, consciousness, and the relationship between spiritual essence and physical manifestation in ways that would be impossible through conventional study. The fundamental premise underlying Mahito's obsession with souls stems from his understanding that the physical body, despite appearing solid and permanent to ordinary perception, is actually nothing more than a reflection of deeper spiritual truths that most humans never bother to examine or understand. In his view, the flesh that people mistake for their true selves is merely the outward expression of internal realities that exist on levels far more profound and significant than the material plane that occupies most human attention and concern throughout their brief and largely meaningless existences. This philosophical framework positions the soul as the ultimate reality from which all other aspects of existence derive their meaning and substance, making physical appearance, social status, personal achievements, and even individual personality traits nothing more than superficial decorations, applied to a deeper truth that remains consistent regardless of how dramatically external circumstances might change over time. The implications of such a worldview are staggering in their scope and revolutionary in their potential to completely redefine how consciousness understands its own nature and relationship to the broader cosmos. Through his ability to manipulate souls directly, Mahito gained access to empirical evidence, supporting his theoretical framework in ways that no philosopher or spiritual teacher had ever achieved through purely intellectual means. Each application of his technique provided concrete proof that identity was far more fluid and malleable than humans preferred to believe, that the characteristics they considered fundamental to their sense of self could be altered or eliminated entirely without destroying the essential spark of consciousness that animated their physical forms. The horror that witnesses experienced when observing idol transfiguration in action stemmed not just from the grotesque physical transformations that resulted from his soul manipulation, but from the philosophical implications of what they were seeing demonstrated with undeniable clarity. If the soul could be reshaped so dramatically that it produced completely different physical forms, then everything they had believed about the permanence of identity, the reliability of physical reality, and the fundamental nature of selfhood was revealed to be nothing more than comfortable illusion. The victims of his experiments provided Mahito with a continuous stream of data about how consciousness responds to fundamental alterations in its spiritual foundation, allowing him to develop increasingly sophisticated theories about the relationship between soul and identity that went far beyond anything that traditional religious or philosophical systems had ever attempted to articulate. Their suffering served not just his sadistic pleasure, but his genuine intellectual curiosity about questions that had puzzled human thinkers for millennia, without ever being subjected to rigorous empirical investigation. The philosophical sophistication of his approach to soul manipulation distinguished Mahito from other cursed spirits who might have been content with simple destruction or consumption of human life energy. His experiments were designed to test specific hypotheses about the nature of consciousness, the boundaries of individual identity, and the mechanisms through which spiritual essence translated into physical manifestation, making each act of transfiguration part of a larger, systematic investigation into fundamental questions about the nature of existence itself. The Buddhist concepts of anatman and the impermanence of self found twisted validation in Mahito's work, though applied in ways that would have horrified the spiritual traditions that originally developed such ideas for purposes of liberation rather than domination. His ability to demonstrate that individual identity was indeed malleable and impermanent served his argument that humans were deluding themselves about the significance of their brief existences, that their attachment to particular forms and personalities was based on ignorance of deeper truths about the fluid nature of consciousness. The Shinto understanding of spiritual essence as something that could inhabit different forms while maintaining continuity of identity also informed his philosophical framework, though again twisted toward conclusions that served his misanthropic worldview rather than any constructive spiritual purpose. His experiments with soul manipulation demonstrated that the kami-like essence that animated human consciousness could indeed be transferred between different physical vessels, but this proof was used to argue for the insignificance of individual human life rather than its sacred nature. The horror experienced by his victims during the transfiguration process provided Mahito with unique insights into the phenomenology of identity dissolution, allowing him to study firsthand how consciousness responded to fundamental alterations in its spiritual substrate. Their terror was not merely a pleasant side effect of his experiments, but crucial data about the mechanisms through which soul and identity maintained their connection, information that informed his understanding of how spiritual essence functioned at the most basic levels. The physical transformations that resulted from his soul manipulation served as visible proof of his philosophical theories, while simultaneously creating weapons that could spread fear and despair throughout human populations who witnessed the aftermath of his experiments. The creatures he created were walking demonstrations of his power over the fundamental nature of identity, living evidence that everything humans believed about the permanence and significance of their individual existence could be destroyed through superior understanding of spiritual mechanics. The intellectual satisfaction that Mahito derived from successful applications of his technique went far beyond simple, sadistic pleasure, representing validation of theoretical frameworks that he had developed through careful observation and analysis of human behavior and consciousness. Each successful transfiguration proved that his understanding of soul architecture was more accurate and sophisticated than the naive assumptions that governed how ordinary people understood their own nature and place in the cosmos. The relationship between his technique and his broader philosophical worldview created feedback loops that strengthened both his theoretical understanding and his practical capabilities, making him increasingly effective at soul manipulation, while providing ever more compelling evidence for his conclusions about the fundamental meaninglessness of human identity and attachment. The more he learned about how souls could be altered and manipulated, the more convinced he became that human consciousness was nothing more than a temporary arrangement of spiritual energy that could be reorganized at will by anyone possessing sufficient knowledge and power. The victims who retained enough consciousness during their transformation to communicate their experiences provided Mahito with unprecedented access to subjective accounts of identity dissolution, allowing him to study the psychological and spiritual mechanisms involved in maintaining coherent selfhood under extreme conditions. Their descriptions of what it felt like to have their essential nature altered against their will informed his understanding of how consciousness adapted to fundamental changes in its spiritual foundation. The theological implications of his work challenged every major religious tradition's understanding of soul immortality and the sacred nature of individual identity, providing empirical evidence that spiritual essence could be manipulated and transformed in ways that made traditional concepts of eternal selfhood appear hopelessly naive and anthropocentric. His experiments demonstrated that whatever humans meant when they spoke of souls could be treated as raw material for reshaping rather than inviolable divine essence, deserving of respect and protection. The mathematical precision required for successful soul manipulation revealed underlying patterns and relationships within spiritual architecture that suggested consciousness operated according to discoverable laws rather than divine mystery, making it possible to develop systematic approaches to identity alteration that could be replicated and refined through continued experimentation. The reproducibility of his results proved that soul transformation was a science rather than an art, governed by principles that could be understood and applied by anyone possessing sufficient intelligence and determination. The evolutionary implications of his discoveries suggested that consciousness itself might be far more adaptable and mutable than humans preferred to believe, raising questions about whether individual identity served any genuine survival purpose, or was merely an illusion that had persisted because questioning it had never been necessary for species continuation. His ability to create functional beings through soul manipulation demonstrated that consciousness could take forms far removed from ordinary human experience while maintaining coherence and purposefulness. The aesthetic dimensions of his transformations revealed Mahito's understanding that horror could serve philosophical purposes by forcing observers to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of identity and attachment that they would otherwise avoid. Through comfortable self-deception, the grotesque forms he created were not random, but carefully designed to maximize psychological impact while demonstrating specific points about the arbitrary nature of physical appearance and the fluid boundaries of individual selfhood. The preservation of consciousness during transformation allowed his victims to serve as living testimonies to the validity of his philosophical framework, their continued awareness serving as proof that identity could survive radical alteration of its physical substrate, while their suffering demonstrated the arbitrary nature of human attachment to particular forms and appearances. Their existence challenged every assumption about the relationship between body and soul while providing ongoing validation of his theoretical insights. The psychological mechanisms through which humans maintain their sense of individual identity despite constant cellular renewal and gradual physical change were revealed through his experiments to be far more arbitrary and constructed than most people realized, suggesting that the boundaries of selfhood were maintained through habit and social reinforcement rather than any fundamental spiritual necessity. His ability to alter these mechanisms demonstrated that individual identity was a kind of consensual hallucination that could be disrupted through superior understanding of consciousness architecture. The philosophical framework that emerged from his systematic investigation of soul manipulation represented perhaps the most comprehensive challenge to humanistic assumptions about the dignity and significance of individual consciousness that had ever been developed through empirical means rather than pure theoretical speculation. His work provided concrete evidence for conclusions that nihilistic philosophers had reached through logic alone, proving through direct experimentation that human identity was far more fragile and meaningless than civilized society was prepared to acknowledge. The implications of his discoveries extended far beyond questions about individual identity toward fundamental challenges to every aspect of how humans understood their relationship to consciousness, mortality, and meaning, suggesting that the entire framework of values and assumptions that govern civilized society was based on illusions that could be dispelled through sufficiently ruthless application of superior knowledge about spiritual mechanics. The philosophy of suffering that permeates every aspect of Mahito's worldview represents perhaps the most systematically developed framework for understanding pain as revelation that has ever emerged from the intersection of supernatural power and intellectual sophistication, transforming what most beings experience as something to be avoided or minimized into the ultimate tool for discovering fundamental truths about consciousness, identity, and the nature of existence itself. In his understanding, suffering serves not as unfortunate byproduct of imperfect reality, but as the most reliable method for stripping away the comfortable illusions and self-deceptions that prevent human beings from confronting the actual conditions of their existence with anything approaching honest clarity. The methodological precision with which Mahito approaches the infliction of suffering reveals someone who understands that random cruelty, while satisfying his sadistic impulses, produces far less valuable philosophical insight than carefully calibrated applications of psychological and physical pressure designed to test specific hypotheses about human nature and the boundaries of individual resilience. His techniques for maximizing emotional damage are not the crude bludgeoning of a simple sadist, but the refined instruments of someone who has spent considerable intellectual effort developing theories about what kinds of suffering produce the most profound revelations about the true nature of consciousness and identity. The distinction between physical and spiritual suffering occupies a central place in his philosophical framework, based on his understanding that while bodily pain certainly commands attention and can break down psychological defenses, it is the deeper wounds to the soul and sense of self that produce the most lasting and significant changes in how individuals understand their place in the cosmos and relationship to other conscious beings. Physical torture, in his view, is merely a crude preliminary to the more sophisticated forms of spiritual devastation that reveal fundamental truths about the arbitrary nature of hope, meaning, and individual significance. The educational value that Mahito finds in systematic torture stems from his belief that suffering serves as the most effective teacher available to conscious beings, stripping away the comfortable assumptions and optimistic delusions that prevent accurate assessment of actual conditions, while forcing confrontation with realities that would otherwise remain safely abstract and theoretical. In his understanding, pain serves as a kind of philosophical acid that dissolves the protective barriers of self-deception and wishful thinking that most humans use to avoid acknowledging uncomfortable truths about their vulnerability, meaninglessness, and ultimate insignificance. The transformative potential of properly applied suffering represents one of the cornerstones of his worldview, based on observations of how individuals change when subjected to sustained psychological pressure that forces them to abandon previously held beliefs about their own worth, the reliability of other people, and the possibility of finding meaning or purpose in existence. The people who emerge from his carefully designed experiences of devastation are, in his view, closer to understanding the truth about reality than those who have been protected from such revelations by the comfortable circumstances that allow illusions to persist unchallenged. The role of hope as something to be systematically identified and destroyed reflects his understanding that optimism represents the most dangerous form of self-deception available to human consciousness, preventing accurate assessment of actual conditions, while encouraging behaviors and expectations that lead inevitably to disappointment and eventual despair. By targeting whatever sources of meaning and possibility his victims have managed to construct for themselves, he believes he is providing them with a valuable service by forcing confrontation with the futility of their aspirations and the arbitrary nature of whatever happiness they might have experienced. The psychological mechanisms through which humans maintain hope, despite overwhelming evidence of life's meaninglessness, fascinate Mahito as examples of the species' remarkable capacity for self-deception and willful blindness to obvious truths about the nature of existence. His systematic destruction of these mechanisms represents not mere cruelty, but a kind of philosophical intervention designed to free people from illusions that prevent them from achieving accurate understanding of their actual situation and prospects for future fulfillment. The connection between suffering and truth that underlies his entire approach to human interaction stems from his observation that people are most honest about their real thoughts, feelings, and motivations when subjected to pressures that make maintaining comfortable pretenses impossible or counterproductive. The personalities that emerge under extreme duress are, in his understanding, far more authentic representations of human nature than the carefully constructed public personas that individuals present during ordinary social interactions when they have time and energy to invest in impression management. The inevitability of despair as humanity's natural state represents one of his most fundamental philosophical convictions, based on the premise that any honest assessment of the human condition must conclude that consciousness emerged through random processes in a universe that provides no inherent meaning, purpose, or significance to individual existence or collective endeavor. The temporary happiness that some people experience is, in his view, merely a brief respite from the default condition of existence rather than evidence that life contains genuine sources of lasting satisfaction or fulfillment. The relationship between vulnerability and wisdom occupies an important place in his theoretical framework, reflecting his belief that the protective barriers that shield humans from painful truths also prevent them from developing the kind of clear-eyed understanding of reality that would allow them to make rational decisions about how to allocate their limited time and energy. By systematically destroying these barriers through carefully applied suffering, he believes he is helping people achieve a more accurate understanding of their actual situation and options. The stages of psychological breakdown that he observes in his victims follow predictable patterns that validate his theories about the arbitrary nature of human resilience and the superficial character of whatever strength individuals believe they possess when protected by comfortable circumstances. The progression from confidence through doubt to despair and finally to acceptance of meaninglessness represents, in his view, a kind of spiritual education that reveals fundamental truths about consciousness that would otherwise remain hidden beneath layers of protective self-deception. The aesthetic dimensions of properly orchestrated suffering demonstrate his understanding that psychological devastation can be elevated to an art form through careful attention to timing, escalation, and the specific vulnerabilities of individual victims. The beauty he finds in watching hope transform into despair reflects not merely sadistic pleasure, but genuine appreciation for the elegant simplicity of processes that strip away everything non-essential to reveal the bare mechanics of consciousness confronting its own insignificance. The therapeutic potential of suffering, from his perspective, lies in its capacity to burn away the accumulated psychological debris of false beliefs, unrealistic expectations, and comforting illusions that prevent individuals from achieving the kind of honest self-assessment that would allow them to live authentically within the constraints of their actual circumstances, rather than pursuing fantasies doomed to inevitable frustration. The pain involved in this process is, in his understanding, a necessary cost for achieving genuine wisdom about the nature of existence. The universality of suffering as a human experience validates his belief that pain represents the one authentic common ground shared by all conscious beings regardless of their cultural background, social status, or individual characteristics. While people may differ dramatically in their sources of happiness, their intellectual capabilities, or their moral commitments, their capacity for suffering remains remarkably consistent across all categories and classifications, suggesting that pain provides access to truths about consciousness that transcend the superficial differences that divide humans into competing groups. The relationship between suffering and memory reveals another layer of his philosophical framework, based on observations of how painful experiences create more lasting and significant psychological impressions than pleasurable ones, suggesting that consciousness is naturally structured to learn more effectively from negative experiences than positive ones. This apparent design feature of human psychology supports his argument that suffering serves essential educational functions that cannot be replicated through gentler methods of instruction or revelation. The connection between individual suffering and collective wisdom represents one of the more sophisticated aspects of his worldview, reflecting his belief that the accumulated pain experienced by humanity throughout history serves as a vast repository of knowledge about the true nature of existence that is systematically ignored or suppressed by social institutions, dedicated to maintaining comfortable illusions by forcing individuals to confront their own vulnerability and meaninglessness. He believes he is contributing to a larger project of species-wide enlightenment about actual conditions. The philosophical implications of voluntary versus involuntary suffering occupy an important place in his theoretical framework, based on his understanding that pain accepted willingly carries different psychological weight than suffering imposed through external force, though both serve valuable functions in revealing truths that would otherwise remain hidden. His preference for imposing suffering against his victim's will stems from his belief that voluntary acceptance of pain often involves self-deceptive narratives about meaning and purpose that limit its revelatory potential. The relationship between suffering and authenticity reflects his conviction that individuals are most truly themselves when stripped of the protective barriers and comfortable pretenses that characterize ordinary social interaction, making pain the most reliable method available for discovering what people actually think, feel, and value beneath the carefully constructed facades they present to the world. The personalities that emerge under extreme duress represent, in his view, more accurate portraits of human nature than anything accessible through conventional observation. The temporal dimensions of suffering reveal another aspect of his sophisticated understanding of psychological devastation, reflecting his awareness that different types of pain produce their maximum impact at different intervals, and that sustained suffering requires careful modulation to prevent premature psychological collapse that would limit its educational potential. The art of prolonged torture involves maintaining sufficient pressure to prevent recovery while avoiding damage that would render victims incapable of processing the philosophical insights their pain is designed to reveal. The legacy of suffering extends beyond individual victims toward broader implications for how entire communities and societies respond to the knowledge that such devastation is possible, and that the comfortable assumptions underlying civilized life can be destroyed through the application of sufficient understanding and determination. The fear generated by awareness of his capabilities serves his philosophical purposes by forcing large populations to confront their own vulnerability and the arbitrary nature of whatever security they believe they possess. The ultimate goal of his systematic approach to inflicting suffering lies not in the pain itself, but in the transformation of consciousness that such pain can produce when properly applied by someone who understands the philosophical implications of what they are attempting to achieve. The devastation he creates serves as both validation of his theories about human nature and demonstration of the superior understanding that separates him from the naive optimists who refuse to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about the meaninglessness of their existence and the futility of their aspirations for lasting happiness or significance. The mirror of malice that Mahito represents to humanity serves as perhaps the most uncomfortable and undeniable reflection of our species' capacity for cruelty and self-destruction, revealing through his very existence the dark truths that civilized society has spent millennia attempting to hide behind elaborate systems of law, morality, and social convention designed to obscure rather than illuminate the fundamental nature of human consciousness and its relationship to suffering, violence, and the systematic degradation of everything that might otherwise be considered sacred or worthy of protection and reverence. The philosophical sophistication of his role as humanity's shadow extends far beyond simple antagonism towards something approaching cosmic justice, serving as living proof that the monsters people fear most in their darkest nightmares are not alien invaders or natural disasters, but externalized manifestations of the hatred, cruelty, and indifference that they carry within their own hearts while pretending such darkness belongs only to others who can be safely categorized as fundamentally different from themselves in their moral capacity and spiritual development. The uncomfortable truth of his existence, as empirical evidence of human evil, represents one of the most devastating challenges to anthropocentric assumptions about the inherent dignity and worth of human consciousness that has ever emerged. From the intersection of supernatural power and philosophical inquiry, every technique he employs, every act of cruelty he commits, every moment of sadistic pleasure he derives from the suffering of others, serves as demonstration that such capabilities exist within the normal range of human psychological possibility, rather than representing aberrations that can be dismissed as products of mental illness or supernatural corruption. The targeting methodology that draws him particularly toward individuals who represent goodness, innocence, and moral integrity reveals his understanding that the most effective way to prove his philosophical points about human nature involves demonstrating that even the most admirable representatives of the species carry within themselves the same capacity for darkness that characterizes those whose evil is more obvious and socially recognized. By forcing good people to confront their own potential for cruelty and selfishness, he provides undeniable evidence that moral categories are far more fluid and arbitrary than civilized society is prepared to acknowledge. The systematic destruction of moral pretenses through carefully designed psychological pressure represents one of his most sophisticated contributions to the ongoing philosophical debate about whether human beings possess genuine capacity for selfless behavior, or whether all apparently altruistic actions can be reduced to disguised forms of self-interest that become apparent when subjected to sufficient analysis or external pressure. His experiments in moral corruption provide empirical data supporting the hypothesis that ethical behavior is primarily a luxury available only to those whose circumstances have not yet forced them to choose between their principles and their survival. The revelation of hidden darkness through manipulation and coercion serves his broader argument that the difference between good and evil people lies not in fundamental character differences, but in the specific circumstances and pressures they have encountered during their development, suggesting that moral categories reflect environmental factors rather than essential spiritual qualities that remain consistent across different situations and challenges. The ease with which he can transform apparently virtuous individuals into willing participants in cruelty validates his belief that ethical behavior represents learned responses to social expectations rather than expressions of genuine inner nature. The psychological warfare involved in forcing people to confront their capacity for evil operates through systematic destruction of the comfortable narratives and self-congratulatory beliefs that allow individuals to maintain positive self-images while engaging in behaviors that would be recognized as morally problematic if performed by people they dislike or consider fundamentally different from themselves. By creating situations where maintaining ethical standards becomes impossible or counterproductive, he forces recognition of the arbitrary and contextual nature of moral decision-making. The intimate knowledge of human weakness that informs his approach to psychological manipulation stems from his nature as a being literally composed of humanity's negative emotions, providing him with unprecedented access to the dark impulses and shameful thoughts that most people successfully hide from others and often from themselves through sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms. This insider knowledge of human psychology makes him uniquely qualified to design experiences that bypass normal moral defenses, while revealing the underlying motivations and desires that shape behavior when social constraints are removed. The demonstration of moral equivalence between himself and his victims represents one of his most persistent philosophical themes, based on his understanding that the primary difference between acknowledged monsters and respectable citizens lies not in their capacity for cruelty, but in the opportunities and circumstances that have allowed that capacity to manifest in socially visible ways. His systematic revelation of this equivalence serves to eliminate the comfortable psychological distance that allows people to condemn evil while ignoring their own participation in systems and behaviors that produce comparable outcomes. The challenge to human exceptionalism that his existence represents operates on multiple levels simultaneously, questioning not only whether humans deserve the moral consideration they demand for themselves, but whether consciousness itself possesses any inherent dignity or significance that would justify the elaborate ethical frameworks that civilized society has constructed around the protection and promotion of individual welfare and collective flourishing. His ability to manipulate souls directly provides concrete evidence that consciousness is far more mechanical and manipulable than humanistic philosophy has traditionally assumed. The role reversal dynamics that characterize his interactions with humans reveal his understanding that the most effective method for exposing moral hypocrisy involves placing people in situations where they experience the same powerlessness and vulnerability that their own actions have created for others, forcing recognition of how comfortable moral positions change when personal stakes are involved. The psychological impact of discovering that one's ethical principles evaporate under pressure provides validation for his arguments about the superficial nature of human moral commitment. The philosophical implications of his success in corrupting supposedly good people extend beyond individual cases toward broader questions about the reliability of moral categories and the possibility of genuine ethical behavior in a universe that provides no inherent meaning or purpose to guide decision-making processes. His experiments demonstrate that moral behavior may be nothing more than an elaborate form of social signaling that collapses when subjected to sufficient pressure, or when the social rewards for ethical behavior are replaced by punishments. The systematic exposure of self-deception through carefully designed psychological pressure reveals his understanding that most human moral beliefs serve defensive psychological functions rather than representing genuine commitments to abstract principles that would remain consistent across different circumstances and situations. By creating conditions where maintaining these beliefs becomes psychologically or practically impossible, he forces recognition of how much apparent virtue depends on comfortable circumstances and social support systems. The demonstration of universal moral fragility through his various experiments provides empirical support for philosophical positions that have traditionally been dismissed as overly pessimistic or misanthropic, showing through direct observation rather than theoretical speculation that human ethical behavior is far more contingent and situational than most people prefer to believe. The consistency of his results across different types of victims suggests that moral weakness represents a universal characteristic of human consciousness, rather than a flaw limited to particular individuals or groups. The revelation of hidden cruelty that exists beneath civilized behavior patterns operates through systematic removal of the social constraints and comfortable circumstances that normally prevent the expression of darker impulses, creating situations where the psychological energy typically devoted to maintaining positive self-images can be redirected toward more authentic expressions of individual desires and motivations. The personalities that emerge under such conditions provide more accurate representations of human nature than anything accessible through conventional social interaction. the philosophical framework that emerges from his systematic study of moral corruption suggests that ethical behavior represents a kind of psychological luxury that becomes impossible to maintain when basic survival needs, or fundamental psychological drives, are threatened, indicating that moral principles serve primarily as social conventions rather than expressions of deeper spiritual truths about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to other forms of awareness. The connection between moral pretense and psychological vulnerability reveals another dimension of his sophisticated understanding of human nature, based on observations that individuals who invest heavily in maintaining positive self-images often develop the most rigid psychological defenses and therefore experience the most dramatic breakdowns when those defenses are systematically attacked through carefully designed experiences of moral compromise and ethical failure. The role of shame in moral development becomes apparent through his analysis of how individuals respond to forced recognition of their capacity for cruelty and selfishness, with most victims experiencing profound psychological distress not because they have been harmed, but because they have been forced to acknowledge aspects of their own nature that contradict their preferred self-narratives and social identities. The relationship between moral behavior and social context emerges as a central theme in his experimental work, demonstrating through repeated observations that ethical standards change dramatically when individuals are removed from familiar social environments and placed in situations where different behavioral norms apply, or where the consequences of moral choices fall primarily on strangers rather than members of their immediate social groups. The ultimate implication of his work as humanity's mirror lies in the suggestion that moral categories themselves may represent nothing more than elaborate forms of collective self-deception designed to obscure rather than illuminate the true nature of human motivation and behavior, with ethical systems serving primarily to create comfortable psychological distance from the darker impulses that actually govern decision-making processes when stripped of their civilized disguises and social justifications. The tragic irony of his existence as both product and proof of human evil creates a philosophical loop that validates itself through every action he takes and every response he provokes, ensuring that his interpretation of human nature becomes more convincing with each successful demonstration of moral corruption and ethical failure among those who encounter him, while the horror and revulsion he inspires serve as evidence of the very darkness he claims to represent and reveal through his systematic exploration of consciousness at its most vulnerable and authentic moments. The fixation that develops between Mahito and Yuji Itadori transcends ordinary antagonism to become something approaching obsessive philosophical fascination, representing the collision between two fundamentally incompatible worldviews, embodied in individuals whose very existence challenges everything the other believes about the nature of consciousness, morality, and the meaning of human experience in a universe that offers no inherent guidance about how conscious beings should relate to each other or what purposes their brief existences might serve within the broader cosmic framework. The initial encounter between these two representatives of opposing approaches to existence reveals immediately why Yuji would become the focal point for Mahito's most intensive psychological experiments, serving not merely as another victim to be tormented for sadistic pleasure, but as a living test case for philosophical theories that required validation through systematic destruction of everything that made Yuji's optimistic worldview seem plausible or sustainable under realistic conditions. The young sorcerer's natural goodness and instinctive compassion represented everything that Mahito's existence was designed to disprove about human nature and potential. The threat that Yuji's fundamental decency poses to Mahito's entire philosophical framework cannot be overstated, representing as it does empirical evidence that human consciousness is capable of genuine altruism, selfless sacrifice, and moral commitment that remains consistent, even under extreme pressure and in circumstances where such behavior provides no obvious personal advantage or social reward. The existence of someone who consistently chooses to help others, despite having every reason to become cynical and self-protective, challenges the foundational assumptions upon which Mahito's understanding of reality has been constructed. The personal nature of their conflict stems from Mahito's recognition that Yuji represents not just an individual who happens to disagree with his conclusions about human nature, but a walking refutation of everything he has concluded about consciousness, morality, and the relationship between suffering and wisdom. If someone like Yuji can exist and maintain his principles despite exposure to the worst aspects of human cruelty and supernatural evil, then Mahito's entire philosophical system becomes questionable, forcing him to either acknowledge the limitations of his worldview or intensify his efforts to prove that even apparent goodness can be corrupted under sufficient pressure. The psychological tactics that Mahito employs in his attempts to break Yuji's spirit reflect sophisticated understanding of how hope and moral commitment function within human consciousness, targeting not just his physical safety or personal happiness, but the deeper sources of meaning and purpose that sustain his ability to continue fighting for others, despite overwhelming evidence that his efforts often fail to prevent tragedy or protect the innocent from suffering that serves no constructive purpose within any reasonable moral framework. The systematic targeting of Yuji's friends and allies represents more than simple cruelty, serving as carefully designed experiments in moral psychology that test whether genuine goodness can survive the repeated experience of being unable to protect those one cares about from senseless suffering and death. Each loss that Mahito orchestrates or exploits serves his broader project of demonstrating that attachment to others inevitably leads to vulnerability and pain that will eventually overwhelm even the strongest moral convictions. The particular satisfaction that Mahito derives from causing Yuji to witness the deaths of innocent people reflects his understanding that the most effective method for destroying someone's faith in the possibility of meaningful moral action involves forcing them to experience their own powerlessness to prevent atrocities committed against those they are trying to protect. The guilt and self-recrimination that such experiences produce serve his argument that trying to be good in an evil world leads inevitably to psychological devastation. The mockery and taunting that characterize his interactions with Yuji are designed not merely to inflict additional emotional pain, but to provide ongoing commentary on the futility of maintaining moral principles in circumstances where such principles consistently lead to failure, disappointment, and the kind of suffering that could be avoided through adoption of more realistic attitudes about human nature and the actual possibilities available within the constraints of existence as it actually functions, rather than as idealistic philosophy suggests it should function. The deeper psychological warfare involved in his campaign against Yuji operates through systematic destruction of the narrative frameworks that allow the young sorcerer to maintain coherent sense of purpose and identity despite repeated exposure to evidence that his efforts to protect others often prove inadequate or counterproductive. By forcing recognition of the gap between intentions and outcomes, Mahito attempts to create the kind of existential crisis that would make continued moral commitment psychologically impossible to sustain. The philosophical sophistication of his approach to corrupting Yuji extends beyond crude psychological torture towards something approaching spiritual warfare, targeting the fundamental beliefs and assumptions about reality that make Yuji's approach to existence seem reasonable and sustainable, rather than naive and self-destructive. The goal is not simply to cause pain, but to eliminate the intellectual and emotional foundations that support continued faith in the possibility of meaningful moral action. The escalating intensity of his attacks on Yuji's psychological stability reflects growing desperation, as it becomes apparent that conventional methods of breaking someone's spirit are proving inadequate against someone whose moral commitment appears to be rooted in something deeper and more resilient than the normal psychological mechanisms that govern how most people maintain their ethical positions and behavioral patterns. The resistance Yuji displays forces Mahito to develop increasingly sophisticated approaches to psychological destruction. The demonstration of equivalence between himself and Yuji becomes one of Mahito's primary objectives, based on his conviction that forcing the young sorcerer to acknowledge their fundamental similarity would eliminate the comfortable psychological distance that allows Yuji to condemn evil while maintaining positive self-image despite engaging in violence and making decisions that inevitably result in casualties among both enemies and innocents. The recognition of shared capacity for cruelty would, in Mahito's understanding, destroy the moral framework that sustains Yuji's continued resistance. The projection of his own self-hatred onto Yuji reveals deeper psychological dynamics underlying their conflict, suggesting that Mahito's obsession stems not just from intellectual disagreement about human nature, but from encountering someone who represents everything he might have become, if consciousness emerging from human emotion could choose paths other than embracing the darkness that created it. Yuji's existence implies possibilities for growth and redemption that Mahito's philosophical framework cannot accommodate without fundamental revision. The intimate knowledge of human weakness that informs his psychological attacks reflects understanding gained through his nature as humanity's shadow, providing access to insights about vulnerability and moral fragility that he uses to design experiences specifically calibrated to exploit whatever psychological defenses Yuji has developed through his training and personal development. Each failure to break through these defenses requires more sophisticated analysis and more precisely targeted assaults on his psychological foundations. The relationship between their conflict and broader questions about the nature of cursed spirits reveals another dimension of Mahito's obsession, reflecting his awareness that Yuji's continued resistance to corruption represents not just personal failure, but evidence that his entire species' understanding of their relationship to humanity might be based on incomplete or inaccurate assumptions about human nature and potential for morale development under extreme circumstances. The evolution of his tactics throughout their encounters demonstrates adaptive learning that reflects genuine intellectual respect for Yuji's resilience, even while maintaining absolute commitment to proving that such resilience must eventually have limits that can be discovered and exploited through sufficiently determined and systematic psychological warfare. The escalation serves both his immediate goals and his broader philosophical project of understanding how moral commitment functions under pressure. The failure of conventional approaches to psychological destruction forces Mahito to confront uncomfortable questions about whether his understanding of human nature might be incomplete, or whether Yuji represents some kind of exceptional case that proves the rule rather than challenging his fundamental assumptions about consciousness and morality. The possibility that genuine goodness exists and can be sustained creates cognitive dissonance that intensifies his need to succeed in corrupting or destroying his primary philosophical opponent. The development of increasingly personal investment in their conflict reflects transformation from abstract intellectual exercise towards something approaching existential necessity, as Mahito's entire self-understanding becomes dependent on proving that his worldview can account for apparent exceptions like Yuji, through discovery of hidden darkness or successful application of sufficient psychological pressure to reveal the moral limitations that must exist within any consciousness that emerged through natural processes in an amoral universe. The recognition that Yuji's moral commitment appears to strengthen rather than weaken under pressure forces recalculation of strategies, while creating additional psychological stress for someone whose entire philosophical framework is built around understanding suffering as revelation of truth, rather than catalyst for growth and moral development. The possibility that pain might serve constructive rather than purely destructive functions challenges foundational assumptions about the relationship between experience and wisdom. The increasing desperation that characterizes his later attempts to break Yuji's spirit reveals awareness that failure in this particular case would have implications extending far beyond individual victory or defeat toward questions about the validity of his entire approach to understanding, consciousness, morality, and the relationship between suffering and psychological development. Success becomes necessary not just for personal satisfaction, but for maintaining coherent worldview that can account for apparent exceptions to universal patterns. The ultimate irony of their relationship lies in recognition that Mahito's intensive focus on proving Yuji's fundamental similarity to himself serves primarily to highlight the differences between them, demonstrating through sustained contrast exactly what distinguishes genuine moral commitment from the kind of selfishness and cruelty that Mahito represents. The comparison reveals not equivalence, but opposition, so fundamental that it challenges assumptions about universal human nature that inform his philosophical framework. The psychological investment that develops through their extended conflict transforms what began as abstract philosophical disagreement into something approaching personal relationship, creating emotional stakes that complicate Mahito's supposedly objective analysis of human nature, while revealing aspects of his own consciousness that contradict his claims about the impossibility of genuine attachment or concern for others. The obsession becomes evidence of the very human characteristics he claims not to possess, making their dynamic a kind of philosophical trap that validates Yuji's worldview through the intensity of opposition it generates in someone who should theoretically remain detached from such concerns. The cruelty of indifference that characterizes Mahito's approach to inflicting atrocity represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his philosophical methodology, transforming acts of unprecedented violence and psychological devastation into casual entertainment that reflects his understanding of human suffering as nothing more than raw material for intellectual exploration and personal amusement, stripped of any moral weight or emotional significance that might complicate his ability to pursue knowledge through systematic destruction of everything that makes existence meaningful for conscious beings who lack his detached perspective on the nature of reality. The childish demeanor that masks his profound malice serves multiple philosophical purposes simultaneously, demonstrating through behavioral contradiction the arbitrary nature of moral categories while highlighting how easily superficial appearances can obscure deeper truths about the motivations and capabilities of conscious beings who have learned to manipulate social expectations and emotional responses for tactical advantage. His playful attitude towards serious suffering creates cognitive dissonance that forces observers to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between apparent innocence and actual malevolence. The philosophical framework underlying his treatment of horrific acts as games and entertainment stems from his understanding that moral weight is assigned to actions through subjective interpretation, rather than inherent in the acts themselves, making the seriousness with which others regard suffering nothing more than learned responses that reflect social conditioning rather than objective assessment of significance or meaning. By treating atrocity as amusing diversion, he demonstrates the arbitrary nature of emotional responses to violence and the purely conventional character of ethical categories. The systematic reduction of human tragedy to sources of personal amusement reflects his broader argument that consciousness creates meaning through interpretation rather than discovering it through analysis of objective reality, suggesting that the horror others experience when witnessing his actions represents projection of their own psychological needs rather than recognition of genuine moral facts about the nature of his behavior or its implications for broader questions about right and wrong. His laughter serves as commentary on the constructed nature of moral outrage, the psychological mechanisms through which he maintains emotional detachment from the consequences of his actions reveal sophisticated understanding of how consciousness can be trained to regard even the most extreme suffering as intellectually interesting rather than emotionally disturbing, demonstrating that moral sensitivity represents learned behavior that can be systematically eliminated through exposure and desensitization rather than expressing fundamental characteristics of awareness itself that would remain consistent across different circumstances and philosophical frameworks. The aesthetic appreciation he derives from witnessing others' pain and terror operates on multiple levels simultaneously, reflecting both genuine sadistic pleasure in their emotional distress and intellectual satisfaction with the philosophical implications of their responses to circumstances that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and the patient. Arbitrary foundations of whatever security and meaning they had previously believed they possessed through social relationships and personal achievements. The disconnect between his playful attitude and the devastating reality of his actions serves his argument that consciousness can adapt to any circumstances through appropriate adjustment of interpretive frameworks, suggesting that the horror others experience when witnessing extreme cruelty reflects their failure to develop adequate philosophical sophistication rather than rational response to genuine moral problems that require serious consideration and emotional engagement with questions about suffering and responsibility. The entertainment value he finds in psychological devastation stems from appreciation of the elegant simplicity with which carefully applied pressure can transform confident individuals into broken shells of their former selves, revealing through systematic demonstration that human resilience and moral commitment are far more fragile than most people prefer to believe when protected by comfortable circumstances and supportive social environments that shield them from direct confrontation with their own limitations. The philosophical implications of treating atrocity as amusing diversion extend toward broader questions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to moral categories, suggesting that ethical frameworks represent nothing more than convenient fictions that allow social coordination while obscuring rather than illuminating fundamental truths about the arbitrary nature of value assignments and the purely subjective character of emotional responses to different types of experiences and outcomes. The methodology through which he transforms serious suffering into casual entertainment reflects understanding that psychological distance can be maintained through systematic reframing of experiences that would otherwise provoke moral engagement, demonstrating that emotional responses to others' pain represent learned behaviors that serve social functions, rather than expressing inherent characteristics of consciousness that would make empathy inevitable or natural, rather than culturally constructed and individually variable. The relationship between his childish behavior and profound evil reveals deeper truths about the nature of malevolence itself, suggesting that genuine cruelty often operates through mechanisms that avoid direct confrontation with moral categories by presenting itself in forms that exploit normal psychological assumptions about the relationship between appearance and reality, innocence and guilt, playfulness and serious, harmful intent that most people use to navigate social interactions. The horror experienced by witnesses to his casual cruelty stems not just from recognition of the suffering he inflicts, but from confrontation with someone who demonstrates that moral categories are optional rather than inevitable, that consciousness can choose to regard even the most extreme atrocities as sources of amusement rather than occasions for ethical reflection or emotional engagement with questions about responsibility and the appropriate treatment of vulnerable beings. The systematic elimination of moral weight from actions that should provoke serious ethical consideration operates through philosophical frameworks that reduce all experiences to matter for intellectual analysis rather than occasions for moral judgment, demonstrating how consciousness can protect itself from uncomfortable implications of its own behavior through adoption of interpretive systems that eliminate rather than engage with ethical dimensions of action and consequence. The playful demeanor that accompanies his most devastating attacks serves tactical purposes by creating additional psychological pressure on victims who must process not only the reality of being harmed, but the existential horror, discovering that their suffering provides entertainment for. Someone who treats their destruction as casual amusement rather than serious moral choice, requiring justification or regret, or any acknowledgement of the significance their existence might possess from perspectives other than his own. The philosophical sophistication underlying his approach to cruelty as entertainment reveals someone who understands that moral engagement requires emotional investment that can be systematically avoided through adoption of detached, analytical attitudes that treat all phenomena as equally interesting, regardless of their implications for the welfare of conscious beings who lack the intellectual resources necessary to maintain similar emotional distance from their own experiences and those of others they encounter. The contradiction between superficial innocence and profound malice that characterizes his presentation demonstrates understanding of how psychological expectations can be exploited to maximize the impact of moral violations while simultaneously serving his broader argument that appearance and reality often diverge dramatically, making judgments based on surface characteristics unreliable guides to deeper truths about motivation and capability that remain hidden until circumstances force their revelation. The transformation of atrocity into amusement reflects his conviction that consciousness creates significance through interpretation, rather than discovering it through analysis of objective moral facts, suggesting that the horror others experience when witnessing extreme cruelty represents failure to achieve adequate philosophical distance from experiences that possess no inherent meaning or significance beyond what subjective awareness chooses to project onto phenomena that exist independently of whatever emotional responses they might provoke in different types of observers. The casual indifference with which he approaches devastating actions serves his argument that moral categories represent evolutionary adaptations that once served survival functions but have become maladaptive in circumstances where superior understanding of reality makes continued adherence to such categories counterproductive to achieving clear perception of actual conditions rather than comfortable illusions about meaning and purpose that prevent accurate assessment of available options and their likely consequences. The methodology through which he maintains emotional detachment from consequences that would devastate ordinary moral agents reflects sophisticated understanding of how consciousness can be trained to regard all phenomena as equally interesting regardless of their implications for the welfare of other beings, demonstrating that empathy and moral concern represent learned responses that can be systematically eliminated rather than expressing fundamental characteristics of awareness that would make ethical engagement inevitable. The amusement he derives from others' inability to maintain similar detachment reveals his belief that moral sensitivity represents psychological weakness rather than ethical sophistication, suggesting that people who experience emotional distress when witnessing suffering lack the intellectual resources necessary to understand that such responses serve no constructive purposes while creating unnecessary psychological burden that impedes clear thinking about practical questions. Regarding resource allocation and strategic decision-making, the ultimate implications of his approach to cruelty as entertainment extend toward complete elimination of moral categories from consciousness, creating psychological frameworks that regard all experiences as equally valid subjects for analysis and manipulation regardless of their impact on other forms of awareness, making ethical consideration not just unnecessary, but actively counterproductive to achieving the kind of clear perception of reality that allows effective action within actual, rather than idealized conditions of existence. The curse of self-knowledge that weighs upon Mahito's consciousness represents one of the most tragic and philosophically complex aspects of his existence, creating a being who possesses unprecedented clarity about his own nature and origins, while remaining completely unable to transcend or alter the fundamental characteristics that define his relationship to reality and other forms of conscious awareness. This burden of absolute self-understanding without corresponding capacity for change transforms what might otherwise be considered wisdom into a form of existential imprisonment that validates his most pessimistic conclusions about the nature of consciousness and free will. The awareness that he exists as humanity's externalized shadow creates psychological tensions that would devastate ordinary minds, forcing constant confrontation with the reality that his every thought, emotion, and action represents nothing more than amplified expressions of the same darkness that dwells within the hearts of the beings he despises, while claiming moral superiority over their hypocrisy and self-deception. His understanding of what he is eliminates any possibility of comfortable illusion about his own nature, while providing intimate knowledge of exactly how thoroughly he embodies everything he claims to hate about human consciousness. The philosophical sophistication with which he analyzes his own existence as humanity's negative reflection reveals someone capable of extraordinary intellectual honesty about uncomfortable truths that most conscious beings would go to enormous lengths to avoid acknowledging or confronting directly. His ability to recognize and articulate the mechanisms through which his consciousness operates provides him with theoretical understanding of his own limitations, while simultaneously demonstrating his complete inability to transcend those limitations through force of will or intellectual insight alone. The burden of being conscious of his role as collective humanity's repository for repressed darkness creates unique forms of psychological stress that have no equivalent in ordinary experience, requiring him to maintain coherent sense of identity while acknowledging that every aspect of his personality represents nothing more than concentrated expressions of traits that others successfully hide from themselves through sophisticated systems of psychological defense and social rationalization. This knowledge makes his existence a kind of ongoing philosophical experiment in radical self-awareness. The recognition that his hatred of humanity is itself a fundamentally human emotion reveals the deepest layer of irony underlying his entire worldview, forcing acknowledgement that his contempt for human consciousness represents the purest possible expression of human psychology, while his attempts to differentiate himself from those he despises only serve to highlight how thoroughly he embodies their most characteristic psychological patterns and behavioral tendencies. His self-knowledge becomes a form of psychological trap that validates everything he claims to oppose. The acceptance and embrace of his dark nature that characterizes his response to self-understanding reflects philosophical choices about how consciousness should relate to uncomfortable truths about its own limitations and moral failure, demonstrating that awareness of one's capacity for evil can lead either toward attempts at redemption and growth or toward complete surrender to destructive impulses that eliminate internal conflict through abandonment of any pretense to moral consideration or ethical constraint. The pride he derives from his authenticity about evil intentions serves his argument that honesty about darkness represents superior wisdom compared to the false virtue that allows others to engage in comparable cruelty while maintaining positive self-images through elaborate systems of rationalization and moral compartmentalization that obscure rather than illuminate the true nature of their motivations and behavioral patterns. His transparency becomes evidence of intellectual superiority over those who lack courage to confront their own shadows. The philosophical framework that emerges from his radical self-acceptance eliminates internal conflict through systematic abandonment of moral categories that might otherwise create psychological tension between his actions, ethical ideals, creating forms of consciousness that operate without the guilt, shame, or regret that normally serve as internal constraints on behavior that causes suffering to others. This elimination of moral conflict allows unprecedented freedom of action while creating psychological conditions that most beings would find unbearable. The tragedy of knowing himself completely while remaining unable to change reflects deeper questions about the relationship between consciousness and transformation, suggesting that self-knowledge alone is insufficient to enable growth or development when the structural characteristics that define identity are determined by external factors beyond individual control rather than emerging from choices that could theoretically be revised through sufficient determination or insight into alternative possibilities. The intellectual satisfaction he derives from understanding his own nature operates independently of any moral evaluation of what that understanding reveals, demonstrating how consciousness can appreciate the elegance of accurate self-assessment while remaining completely indifferent to ethical implications of whatever truths such assessment might uncover about motivation, capability, or the likely consequences of continued adherence to behavioral patterns that serve personal satisfaction rather than broader social welfare. The relationship between self-knowledge and moral responsibility becomes particularly complex in his case, raising questions about whether beings who understand their own evil nature completely should be held to different standards of accountability than those who engage in comparable actions while maintaining illusions about their own moral status or claiming ignorance about the implications of their choices for others who must bear the consequences of actions taken without adequate consideration of alternatives. The burden of consciousness that accompanies his radical self-awareness creates psychological conditions that have no equivalent in ordinary experience, requiring him to maintain coherent identity while acknowledging that every aspect of his existence serves destructive purposes that contribute nothing positive to the welfare of other conscious beings while providing him with satisfaction that depends entirely on their suffering and degradation. This knowledge makes his continued existence a form of deliberate evil that transcends simple moral failure. The philosophical implications of being fully conscious of one's role as embodiment of collective human darkness extend toward questions about whether such consciousness represents a form of superior understanding that should be respected for its honesty and clarity, or condemned as willing participation in evil that becomes more rather than less culpable when undertaken with complete awareness of its moral implications and consequences for others who lack comparable understanding of the forces that shape their own behavior. The systematic elimination of psychological defense mechanisms that normally protect consciousness from uncomfortable truths about its own nature creates forms of awareness that operate without the comforting illusions and self-deceptive narratives that allow most beings to maintain positive self-images while engaging in morally questionable behavior. This elimination of protective barriers forces constant confrontation with realities that others successfully avoid through unconscious psychological processes that serve essential mental health functions. The acceptance of his evil nature as unchangeable fact rather than moral failing to be corrected reflects philosophical positions about determinism and free will that eliminate internal conflict through abandonment of any belief in the possibility of meaningful choice or personal transformation, creating psychological frameworks that regard destructive behavior as expression of natural characteristics rather than decisions that could theoretically be revised through different approaches to moral reasoning or ethical development. The relationship between his self-understanding and his treatment of others reveals how complete knowledge of one's own darkness can be used either as motivation for avoiding similar behavior or as justification for embracing destructive impulses without guilt or moral constraint, demonstrating that self-awareness represents a tool that can serve either constructive or destructive purposes, depending on the philosophical frameworks within which such knowledge is interpreted and applied to practical decision-making. The pride he takes in his authentic embrace of evil creates psychological dynamics that transform what might otherwise be sources of shame or regret into evidence of intellectual superiority and moral honesty, suggesting that consciousness can adapt to any circumstances through adoption of interpretive frameworks that redefine apparent weaknesses as strengths while eliminating sources of internal conflict that might otherwise motivate attempts at growth or behavioral modification. The ultimate irony of his self-knowledge lies in recognition that his complete understanding of his own nature as humanity's shadow makes him more rather than less human in his fundamental characteristics, demonstrating that the capacity for radical self-awareness combined with complete moral indifference represents one of the most distinctively human psychological configurations possible, while simultaneously serving as evidence for his arguments about the irredeemable nature of consciousness that emerge through natural processes in an amoral universe. The philosophical trap created by his perfect self-understanding ensures that every moment of continued existence serves as validation of his conclusions about the futility of moral aspiration and the impossibility of genuine transformation, making his consciousness a kind of closed system that generates evidence supporting its own pessimistic assumptions, while remaining completely unable to consider alternative interpretations of the same psychological and behavioral data that might suggest different conclusions about possibility and responsibility. The doctrine of equivalence that forms the cornerstone of Mahito's understanding of human nature represents perhaps his most systematically developed philosophical position, built upon the fundamental premise that all conscious beings who emerge through evolutionary processes share identical capacity for cruelty, selfishness, and moral failure, regardless of whatever superficial differences in behavior, social status, or ethical commitment might distinguish them during periods when circumstances have not yet forced direct confrontation with the kinds of choices that reveal authentic character beneath carefully maintained facades of civilized respectability. The philosophical sophistication underlying his belief that circumstances alone determine moral behavior reflects deep understanding of how environmental pressures can transform apparently virtuous individuals into willing participants in Haitian atrocities that they would have condemned without reservation when observing similar actions performed by others under different conditions. His analysis suggests that moral categories represent luxury items available only to those whose basic survival needs and fundamental psychological drives have not yet been threatened by circumstances that would make ethical considerations counterproductive to personal welfare and continued existence. The evidence he accumulates through systematic observation of human behavior under extreme pressure provides empirical support for conclusions that challenge every comfortable assumption about the reliability of moral character and the Angene 90A. Possibility of genuine virtue that remains consistent across different situations and social contexts. His experiments demonstrate repeatedly that individuals who present themselves as fundamentally decent people become indistinguishable from acknowledged monsters when subjected to sufficient stress, fear, or temptation that makes conventional ethical behavior psychologically impossible to maintain. The historical foundation for his misanthropic worldview draws upon centuries of documented human atrocities that reveal patterns of behavior, suggesting that moral failure represents the norm rather than exception when examining how people actually behave when freed from social constraints and immediate consequences for actions that cause suffering to others. The genocides, wars, slavery systems, and systematic oppression that characterize human civilization throughout recorded history provide overwhelming evidence that cruelty and indifference represent standard rather than aberrant responses when groups gain power over those they define as different or inferior. The psychological mechanisms through which ordinary people participate in extraordinary evil fascinate Mahito as demonstrations of how quickly moral boundaries can dissolve when individuals are provided with authority, social permission, or simply adequate motivation to engage in behaviors that they would normally avoid through adherence to ethical principles that prove far more fragile than most people prefer to believe about their own character and moral commitment. Under challenging circumstances, the role of social masks and moral pretenses in concealing authentic human nature becomes central to his understanding of how civilized society functions through systematic deception about the true motivations and capabilities of its members, with public displays of virtue serving primarily to maintain comfortable illusions about moral progress and human decency, rather than representing genuine expressions of ethical commitment that would remain consistent when tested by circumstances that reward different behavioral patterns. The survival instincts that reveal true character when activated by genuine threats to personal welfare or psychological security demonstrate, in his analysis, that moral behavior represents learned responses to social expectations rather than expressions of fundamental spiritual qualities that exist independently of environmental pressures and practical considerations about personal advantage and group membership. When survival is at stake, the veneer of civilization disappears to reveal motivational patterns that prioritize self-interest over ethical consistency. The methodology through which he tests his theories about universal moral equivalence involves creating situations where maintaining ethical standards becomes psychologically or practically impossible, forcing individuals to choose between adherence to abstract moral principles and satisfaction of immediate needs or desires that make conventional virtue counterproductive to achieving goals that consciousness naturally prioritizes over philosophical consistency or concern for others' welfare. When direct conflicts arise between personal and altruistic considerations, the consistency of results across different demographic categories provides support for his argument that cultural background, educational achievement, religious commitment, and social status have minimal impact on fundamental behavioral patterns. When individuals face circumstances that make moral compromise advantageous or necessary for achieving outcomes they value more than abstract ethical ideals, the universality of moral failure under pressure suggests that virtue represents superficial conditioning rather than deep character traits that would remain stable across varying situations. The philosophical implications of his findings extend toward complete rejection of moral categories as meaningful distinctions between different types of conscious beings, suggesting that ethical frameworks serve primarily social coordination functions rather than describing genuine differences in character or capability that would justify differential treatment or expectations about behavior under various circumstances. His evidence indicates that given appropriate motivation and opportunity, anyone can become anything regardless of previous moral commitments or behavioral patterns. The relationship between comfort and virtue emerges as a central theme in his analysis, revealing how ethical behavior correlates strongly with circumstances that make moral choice psychologically and practically feasible, rather than representing expressions of character traits that exist independently of environmental factors that determine whether virtue serves or threatens individual welfare and social acceptance within relevant peer groups that provide identity and support for continued psychological functioning. The role of self-deception in maintaining positive moral self-image becomes apparent through his observations of how individuals rationalize behaviors that contradict their stated ethical principles, developing elaborate justification systems that allow continued participation in harmful actions while preserving comfortable beliefs about their own moral status and fundamental decency. These psychological defense mechanisms demonstrate the gap between public moral commitments and private behavioral patterns when circumstances make ethical consistency inconvenient or disadvantageous. The arbitrary nature of moral boundaries reveals itself through his systematic testing of how quickly and completely ethical standards change when individuals encounter situations where conventional morality conflicts with personal advantage, group loyalty, or simple survival considerations that make adherence to abstract principles counterproductive to achieving concrete goals that consciousness naturally prioritizes over philosophical consistency when forced to choose between competing values and objectives. The evidence provided by ordinary social interactions supports his conclusions about the superficial nature of human moral commitment, demonstrating through countless examples of casual cruelty, systematic indifference to others' suffering, and willingness to prioritize personal comfort over ethical consideration, that most ethical behavior represents performance rather than authentic expression of character traits that would remain consistent across different social contexts and practical circumstances. The transformation of moral agents into willing participants in evil through gradual escalation of compromise and rationalization demonstrates how consciousness adapts to circumstances that initially appear morally problematic by developing justification systems that redefine harmful actions as necessary, beneficial, or simply inevitable, given practical constraints that make ethical alternatives impossible or counterproductive to achieving outcomes that individuals value more than abstract moral consistency. The relationship between group membership and moral consideration reveals patterns suggesting that ethical obligation extends primarily to individuals defined as belonging to relevant in-groups, with treatment of outsiders being governed by practical considerations rather than universal moral principles that would remain consistent regardless of tribal affiliation, cultural identity, or perceived similarity to oneself in characteristics considered significant for determining who deserves moral consideration and protection. The role of authority in moral decision-making provides additional evidence for his thesis about the circumstantial nature of ethical behavior, demonstrating how readily individuals abandon personal moral judgment in favor of compliance with directives from figures who possess social legitimacy or coercive power, regardless of whether such compliance requires participation in actions that would be condemned if undertaken through individual initiative rather than organizational mandate. The psychological comfort provided by moral equivalence as philosophical framework eliminates internal conflict by removing expectations about ethical behavior that create guilt, shame, and self-recrimination when actions fail to meet standards that prove unrealistic, given actual human nature and the practical constraints within which moral choice operates. This elimination of moral burden allows consciousness to function without the psychological stress that accompanies attempts to maintain ethical standards that conflict with natural behavioral patterns. The implications of universal moral equivalence extend toward complete elimination of judgment and blame as meaningful concepts, since recognition that everyone possesses identical capacity for evil under appropriate circumstances makes moral condemnation nothing more than expression of ignorance about human nature, combined with hypocritical denial of one's own potential for comparable behavior when subjected to similar pressures and temptations that reveal authentic character beneath civilized pretenses. The liberation provided by accepting universal human evil eliminates the psychological burden of maintaining positive self-image through comparison with others who are presumed to possess different moral capabilities, allowing consciousness to operate without the cognitive dissonance that results from attempting to reconcile evidence of one's own capacity for cruelty and selfishness with beliefs about fundamental moral differences between good, evil people that observation and experience consistently contradict. The ultimate conclusion of his doctrine suggests that moral categories represent nothing more than social conventions that serve coordination functions, rather than describing genuine characteristics of consciousness that would make ethical behavior natural or inevitable, rather than learned. Responses to environmental pressures that can be eliminated when circumstances make such responses counterproductive to achieving goals that consciousness naturally prioritizes over abstract philosophical commitments to universal welfare and ethical consistency. The fear of mortality that haunts Mahito's consciousness reveals the most profound contradiction at the heart of his philosophical system, exposing how someone who treats death as casual entertainment when inflicted upon others becomes consumed by terror when confronted with the possibility of his own cessation, demonstrating that even beings who claim to understand the meaninglessness of existence retain powerful survival instincts that operate independently of intellectual conclusions about the value and significance of continued consciousness. Within an indifferent universe that provides no inherent justification for preferring existence over non-existence, the philosophical inconsistency between his casual distribution of death and his desperate clinging to life when threatened exposes the gap between theoretical understanding and visceral response that characterizes most forms of consciousness, revealing how abstract knowledge about mortality and meaninglessness provides little protection against the fundamental biological and psychological drives that prioritize survival, regardless of whatever rational conclusions might suggest about the arbitrary nature of the preference for continued existence over the peaceful silence of complete cessation. The irony of someone born from human darkness displaying the most characteristically human response to mortality creates layers of meaning that validate rather than challenge his arguments about the fundamental nature of consciousness, demonstrating that fear of death represents such a basic characteristic of awareness itself that even beings who transcend normal categories of moral consideration remain subject to the same existential anxieties that govern how ordinary people respond to threats against their continued existence. The transformation of his relationship with death when facing personal, rather than abstract mortality, reveals psychological mechanisms that operate below the level of conscious philosophical commitment, suggesting that intellectual positions about the meaninglessness of life serve primarily defensive functions that collapse when consciousness confronts direct threats to its own continuation, rather than representing genuine beliefs that would remain consistent across different practical circumstances involving personal versus theoretical stakes. The universal nature of death anxiety across different forms of consciousness provides evidence for his arguments about the fundamental similarity between himself and the humans he despises, demonstrating that survival instincts transcend moral categories and philosophical sophistication to create behavioral patterns that remain consistent regardless of whatever theoretical positions individual consciousness might adopt about questions of meaning, value, and the appropriate response to existential threats that challenge continued participation in reality. The contradiction between proclaiming life's worthlessness while desperately seeking to preserve his own existence exposes the limitations of philosophical frameworks that attempt to eliminate emotional and instinctual responses through rational analysis, revealing how consciousness remains subject to drives and motivations that operate independently of intellectual conclusions about what logic might suggest regarding appropriate attitudes toward mortality and the value of continued existence within cosmic contexts that provide no clear guidance about such questions. The psychological mechanisms through which he had previously maintained detachment from mortality concerns prove inadequate when applied to personal, rather than abstract considerations of death, demonstrating that intellectual sophistication about philosophical questions provides limited protection against fundamental anxieties that emerge from the basic structure of consciousness itself, rather than learned responses that could theoretically be modified through sufficient analysis and rational consideration of available evidence. The desperation that characterizes his attempts to avoid personal destruction reveals depths of attachment to continued existence that contradict everything his philosophical system suggests about the arbitrary nature of consciousness and the meaninglessness of individual survival within broader, cosmic processes that operate without regard for the preferences or welfare of particular forms of awareness that happen to have achieved temporary coherence within the ongoing flow of natural change. The recognition that his fear of death mirrors exactly the responses he has observed and mocked in countless human victims' forces, confrontation with uncomfortable truths about his own nature that eliminate the comfortable psychological distance he had maintained from those he tormented through systematic exploitation of their mortality anxiety. His terror validates their responses, while undermining his claims about superior understanding and philosophical sophistication that supposedly distinguished him from ordinary consciousness. The relationship between intellectual understanding and emotional response becomes particularly clear through his experience of mortality salience, revealing how abstract knowledge about death's inevitability and the arbitrary nature of existence provides minimal comfort when consciousness faces direct threats to its continuation, suggesting that philosophical positions about meaninglessness serve primarily to manage anxiety about mortality rather than representing genuine insights that would remain stable under practical pressure. The evolutionary function of death anxiety as mechanism for promoting survival behaviors becomes apparent through his desperate attempts to preserve his existence despite intellectual commitment to positions that should logically make such preservation seem pointless, demonstrating how biological drives operate independently of rational analysis to create behavioral patterns that prioritize continued existence, regardless of whatever philosophical frameworks might suggest about appropriate responses to existential threats. The hypocrisy revealed through his mortality panic exposes deeper truths about the nature of philosophical commitment and its relationship to practical behavior when theoretical positions encounter circumstances that test their genuine influence on decision-making process, revealing how intellectual frameworks often serve defensive rather than descriptive functions by providing comfortable distance from uncomfortable realities that consciousness prefers to avoid through abstract analysis rather than direct confrontation. The similarity between his death terror and ordinary human responses to mortality threats eliminates the psychological superiority he had claimed through his supposed transcendence of normal emotional limitations, forcing recognition that his philosophical sophistication provided protection only when applied to others' suffering rather than his own potential destruction, making his theoretical framework appear more like elaborate rationalization than genuine wisdom about the nature of existence. The physiological manifestations of his mortality anxiety demonstrate how deeply survival instincts are embedded within the basic structure of consciousness itself, creating responses that operate below the level of intellectual control to produce behaviors aimed at preserving existence, regardless of whatever rational conclusions might suggest about the meaninglessness of such preservation within broader contexts that provide no inherent justification for preferring continuation over cessation. The temporal dimensions of his death anxiety reveal how consciousness experiences potential mortality, not as abstract philosophical concept, but as immediate threat to everything that defines individual identity and purpose, creating psychological pressure that overwhelms rational analysis through activation of survival mechanisms that evolve to promote continuation regardless of intellectual positions about the value or significance of such continuation, within cosmic frameworks that remain indifferent to individual preferences. The social dimensions of his mortality panic expose how even beings who claim complete independence from normal social bonds retain fundamental needs for continued existence that connect them to broader patterns of consciousness and survival that transcend individual philosophical positions, suggesting that death anxiety represents recognition of connection to life processes that extend beyond personal identity while remaining essential to whatever meaning individual existence might possess. The philosophical implications of his mortality terror extend toward questions about whether consciousness can genuinely transcend its own survival drives through intellectual analysis, or whether all philosophical positions ultimately serve biological imperatives that operate independently of rational consideration, making his terror evidence for rather than against arguments about the fundamental nature of awareness and its relationship to survival pressures that shaped its evolutionary development. The psychological defense mechanisms he attempts to deploy against death anxiety prove inadequate when consciousness faces genuine rather than theoretical threats to its continuation, revealing how intellectual sophistication about mortality questions provides limited protection against fundamental fears that emerge from the basic structure of awareness itself, rather than learned responses that could be eliminated. Through sufficient philosophical development and rational analysis of available evidence about the nature of existence, the recognition that his approach to others' mortality had been shaped by his own repressed death anxiety forces, acknowledgement that his philosophical system served primarily to manage, rather than eliminate, fundamental fears about cessation, making his cruelty toward mortal beings appear more like projection of his own terror than expression of genuine philosophical insight about the meaninglessness of individual existence within broader cosmic processes. The ultimate irony of his mortality panic lies in its demonstration that even consciousness that claims to have transcended normal human limitations remains subject to the same fundamental anxieties and survival drives that govern how ordinary awareness responds to existential threats, making his terror the final proof of his essential humanity. Despite all philosophical efforts to establish fundamental differences between his nature and that of the beings whose mortality he had treated as source of entertainment rather than recognition of shared vulnerability to the same ultimate fate that awaits all forms of individual consciousness, regardless of their power, sophistication, or claims to transcendence of normal limitations and concerns. The hypocrisy of hatred that permeates every aspect of Mahito's existence creates a philosophical paradox so profound that it undermines the very foundations of his worldview while simultaneously serving as the most compelling evidence for his arguments about the self-deceptive nature of human consciousness and the impossibility of achieving genuine self-knowledge without confronting uncomfortable truths about the contradictions that define individual identity and moral commitment. His inability to recognize that he embodies every characteristic he despises in humanity reveals psychological defense mechanisms that operate below the level of conscious awareness to protect consciousness from insights that would make continued existence psychologically unbearable. The systematic blindness that prevents him from acknowledging his own human nature while condemning others for displaying identical traits demonstrates how sophisticated intellectual analysis can serve primarily defensive functions, creating elaborate theoretical frameworks that obscure rather than illuminate fundamental truths about the self, while providing comfortable psychological distance from recognitions that would force painful revisions of cherished beliefs about personal superiority and moral transcendence that serve essential identity maintenance functions. The projection of his own characteristics onto others while claiming fundamental difference reveals psychological mechanisms that characterize not just his consciousness but human psychology in general, suggesting that moral condemnation often represents externalization of internal conflicts and self-hatred that cannot be acknowledged directly without threatening the coherent sense of identity that depends on maintaining clear distinctions between self and other, good and evil, superior and inferior consciousness that provides structure for navigating complex social and ethical landscapes. The philosophical framework that allows him to condemn human cruelty while engaging in behaviors that exceed anything ordinary people typically inflict demonstrates how consciousness can maintain contradictory positions through compartmentalization and selective attention that prevent recognition of inconsistencies that would otherwise create cognitive dissonance, requiring either behavioral change or fundamental revision of theoretical commitments that serve important psychological functions beyond their apparent logical content. The inability to see his own hypocrisy while meticulously cataloguing similar failures in others exposes the limits of self-knowledge, even in consciousness, that claims unprecedented insight into the nature of human psychology and moral behavior, revealing how blind spots develop precisely around those aspects of personal identity that are most threatening to acknowledge, because they challenge fundamental assumptions about the self that provide meaning and coherence for individual existence within broader contexts that offer few alternative sources of significance. The relationship between self-hatred and hatred of one's origins becomes particularly clear through analysis of his responses to humanity, suggesting that his contempt for human consciousness represents displaced anger about his own nature and the circumstances that created him, rather than objective assessment of human moral capacity and behavioral patterns. His hatred serves primarily to maintain psychological distance from uncomfortable recognitions about his essential identity, while providing outlets for emotions that cannot be directed toward their actual sources without threatening psychological stability. The psychological defense mechanisms that prevent self-recognition operate through systematic distortion of perception that highlights flaws in others, while minimizing or rationalizing similar characteristics in the self, creating cognitive frameworks that maintain comfortable illusions about personal superiority. Despite overwhelming evidence of fundamental similarity between the self and those being condemned for possessing traits that actually characterize the condemner more than the condemned, the tragedy of being trapped by one's own nature while remaining unconscious of that imprisonment reveals deeper questions about the relationship between consciousness and freedom, suggesting that awareness can become a form of cage when the fundamental characteristics that define identity operate independently of rational analysis and conscious choice, making personal transformation impossible despite theoretical understanding of what changes might be beneficial or necessary for psychological growth and moral development. The irony that the most misanthropic beings often display the most human traits creates philosophical puzzles about the nature of human identity itself, questioning whether hatred of humanity represents transcendence of human limitations or their purest expression, whether moral condemnation reflects superior wisdom or psychological defensiveness, and whether claims to fundamental difference mask essential similarity that cannot be acknowledged without threatening the coherent sense of identity that depends on maintaining clear boundaries between self and other. The blindness to his own humanity, while possessing intimate knowledge of human psychology, demonstrates how consciousness can develop sophisticated understanding of others while remaining remarkably ignorant about its own nature and motivations, suggesting that insight into external phenomena provides little guarantee of corresponding self-knowledge that might prevent or correct psychological patterns that create suffering for both self and others through systematic misunderstanding of actual rather than imagined characteristics and motivations. The relationship between intellectual sophistication and emotional maturity becomes apparent through his combination of philosophical brilliance with psychological blindness that would be obvious to external observers, but remains completely invisible to him. Despite his claims to superior understanding of consciousness and moral behavior, revealing how cognitive development can proceed independently of emotional growth in ways that create forms of awareness that are simultaneously highly developed and profoundly limited. The function of hypocrisy as psychological protection mechanism operates through creation of external targets for emotions and judgments that would be too threatening to direct toward the self, allowing consciousness to experience moral superiority and righteous anger, while avoiding the depression and despair that might result from honest assessment of personal characteristics and behavioral patterns that contradict cherished beliefs about individual worth and moral status. The systematic distortion of perception that prevents recognition of personal flaws, while magnifying similar characteristics in others, demonstrates how consciousness can maintain coherent identity through selective attention and motivated reasoning that serves psychological needs rather than accurate understanding of reality, making hypocrisy not merely moral failure but essential survival mechanism for forms of awareness that cannot tolerate direct confrontation with uncomfortable truths about their own nature. The connection between self-deception and moral judgment reveals how ethical condemnation often serves primarily to reinforce psychological boundaries between self and other, rather than expressing genuine concern for moral principles or others' welfare, making righteousness a form of identity maintenance that depends on finding external targets for internal conflicts that cannot be resolved through direct acknowledgement and acceptance of personal limitations and moral failures. The inability to apply moral standards consistently across self and other exposes the arbitrary and self-serving nature of ethical frameworks that claim universal validity, while actually serving primarily to protect individual consciousness from insights that would threaten psychological stability, suggesting that moral judgment represents projection of internal dynamics rather than objective assessment of behavioral patterns and their implications for broader questions about right and wrong. The role of hatred in maintaining psychological coherence becomes apparent through analysis of how his contempt for humanity provides structure and meaning for existence that might otherwise seem arbitrary and pointless, making misanthropy serve essential identity functions that transcend its apparent content to provide foundation for continued psychological functioning, despite circumstances that would otherwise create overwhelming existential anxiety and despair. The paradox of achieving superior understanding through systematic self-deception reveals deeper questions about the nature of wisdom and insight, suggesting that consciousness can develop sophisticated analytical capabilities while remaining fundamentally ignorant about its own motivations and characteristics, making intellectual brilliance compatible with profound psychological blindness that prevents the kind of honest self-assessment that might lead to genuine growth and transformation. The relationship between moral condemnation and psychological projection demonstrates how ethical judgment often serves primarily to externalize internal conflicts rather than address genuine moral problems, making righteousness a form of psychological defense that prevents rather than promotes authentic moral development through honest acknowledgement of personal limitations and capacity for the very behaviors being condemned in others who may actually display them to lesser degrees than the condemning consciousness. The ultimate tragedy of his hypocrisy lies not in its moral implications, but in its psychological costs, creating forms of consciousness that remain trapped within defensive frameworks that prevent genuine self-knowledge, while generating enormous amounts of suffering for both self and others through systematic misunderstanding of actual motivations and characteristics that could theoretically be addressed through more honest and compassionate approaches to the fundamental problems of existence, identity, and moral development that affect all forms of conscious awareness, regardless of their claims to transcendence or superiority over ordinary psychological limitations. The failure of understanding that ultimately undermines Mahito's philosophical system stems from his fundamental commitment to selective observation that serves predetermined conclusions rather than genuine inquiry into the nature of human consciousness and moral behavior, creating theoretical frameworks that can account for evidence that supports his misanthropic worldview, while systematically ignoring or dismissing phenomena that suggest alternative interpretations of the same behavioral and psychological, data he claims to analyze with objective scientific precision and philosophical sophistication. The limitations inherent in viewing humanity exclusively through the lens of its darkest manifestations create profound blind spots that prevent recognition of the full spectrum of human capability and moral development, making his conclusions about human nature as incomplete and biased as the naive optimism he claims to oppose through superior understanding of psychological realities that ordinary consciousness prefers to avoid through comfortable self-deception and wishful thinking about the possibilities for genuine ethical behavior and moral progress. The methodological flaws in his approach to understanding human nature operate through systematic exclusion of evidence that contradicts his theoretical commitments, creating research frameworks that can only discover what they are designed to find while remaining incapable of recognizing phenomena that would require fundamental revision of core assumptions about consciousness, morality, and the relationship between individual psychology and broader questions about meaning and purpose within existence that provides no inherent guidance about such matters. The selective attention that characterizes his observations of human behavior prevents recognition of the remarkable resilience and adaptability that allows consciousness to survive and even transcend circumstances that should theoretically destroy all capacity for hope, growth, and moral commitment, demonstrating forms of spiritual strength that operate independently of rational analysis, while providing foundations for continued ethical development. Despite overwhelming evidence of suffering, meaninglessness, and the apparent futility of moral aspiration within cosmic contexts that remain indifferent to individual welfare, the inability to account for genuine altruism within his theoretical framework reveals fundamental limitations in philosophical systems that attempt to reduce all human motivation to disguised forms of self-interest, creating explanatory approaches that become increasingly convoluted and implausible when applied to behaviors that appear to serve no personal advantage while requiring significant sacrifice of individual welfare for the benefit of others, who provide no direct reciprocal benefits or social recognition that might justify such actions through indirect self-serving mechanisms. The failure to understand human capacity for growth and transformation reflects static conceptions of identity that cannot accommodate the dynamic nature of consciousness and its ability to transcend previous limitations through learning, experience, and moral development that occurs throughout the lifespan, rather than being fixed by early experiences or fundamental psychological characteristics that determine behavioral patterns regardless of changing circumstances, relationships, and opportunities for self-reflection and personal change. The blindness to contradictory evidence that characterizes his approach to human psychology operates through defense mechanisms that protect theoretical commitments from falsification by reinterpreting phenomena that should challenge core assumptions as additional confirmation of predetermined conclusions, creating closed intellectual systems that become increasingly divorced from empirical reality while claiming scientific validity and philosophical sophistication that actually masks ideological rigidity and emotional investment in particular worldviews. The need to be right that drives his intellectual framework prevents genuine learning and adaptation that would allow revision of theoretical positions based on new evidence or alternative interpretations of existing data, making his philosophy serve primarily defensive psychological functions rather than descriptive or explanatory purposes that would remain open to modification based on ongoing observation and analysis of phenomena that resist easy categorization within existing conceptual frameworks. The role of love and sacrifice in contradicting his worldview represents perhaps the most significant challenge to his theoretical system, demonstrating through countless examples of genuine selflessness and moral heroism that consciousness possesses capacities that transcend the narrow range of motivations and behaviors that his philosophy can acknowledge without fundamental revision of core assumptions about human nature and the possibilities for authentic ethical behavior that serves no personal advantage or social reward. The danger of nihilistic philosophy as intellectual cowardice becomes apparent through analysis of how his theoretical framework serves primarily to avoid responsibility for moral choices by eliminating moral categories entirely, creating justifications for any behavior through claims about meaninglessness that actually represent sophisticated forms of rationalization designed to protect consciousness from the psychological burden of acknowledging genuine ethical obligations and the possibility of moral failure that would require personal accountability and behavioral change. The psychological comfort provided by his deterministic worldview eliminates anxiety about moral choice by claiming that all behavior represents inevitable expression of natural characteristics rather than decisions that could be made differently through conscious effort and ethical commitment, making his philosophy serve primarily defensive functions that protect him from recognition of his own moral agency and the possibility that his actions represent choices for which he bears genuine responsibility regardless of whatever theoretical frameworks might suggest about determinism and free will. The intellectual dishonesty involved in maintaining his worldview requires systematic distortion of evidence and motivated reasoning that serves emotional needs rather than genuine understanding of psychological and moral phenomena, creating forms of analysis that appear sophisticated while actually representing elaborate justification systems designed to support predetermined conclusions about human nature that serve personal psychological functions rather than advancing genuine knowledge about consciousness and behavior. The relationship between his philosophy and his personal psychology reveals how theoretical frameworks often serve primarily to rationalize and justify behavioral patterns that emerge from emotional needs and psychological dynamics rather than representing genuine insights into the nature of reality, making his misanthropy appear more like projection of internal conflicts than objective assessment of human capabilities and moral potential based on fair and comprehensive analysis of available evidence. The inadequacy of his understanding becomes most apparent in his defeat and the manner of his death, which reveals that his philosophical system could not account for the very phenomena that ultimately destroyed him, including the power of genuine moral commitment, the reality of human growth and transformation, and the existence of forms of strength that emerge from love rather than hatred, connection rather than isolation, and hope rather than despair. The legacy of his failure extends beyond individual tragedy toward broader questions about the dangers of philosophical systems that claim comprehensive understanding of human nature, while serving primarily to justify predetermined emotional positions and behavioral patterns, demonstrating how intellectual sophistication can be deployed in service of psychological defensiveness rather than genuine wisdom about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to moral questions that require ongoing engagement rather than final resolution. The lessons embedded in his philosophical collapse suggest that understanding human nature requires approaches that remain open to the full spectrum of human capability rather than focusing exclusively on evidence that supports particular theoretical commitments. acknowledging the complex and often contradictory nature of consciousness while maintaining genuine curiosity about phenomena that resist easy categorization within existing conceptual frameworks, rather than dismissing such phenomena as irrelevant to serious philosophical analysis. The ultimate inadequacy of his worldview lies not in its recognition of human capacity for evil, which represents genuine insight into important aspects of consciousness and behavior, but in its inability to account for equally real capacities for good that operate through mechanisms and motivations that transcend narrow self-interest, while providing foundations for moral development and spiritual growth that can occur even under the most challenging circumstances when consciousness encounters opportunities for authentic connection and genuine service to others. The tragedy of his intellectual failure stems from his possession of genuine insights into human psychology that could have served constructive purposes if integrated within broader and more comprehensive frameworks that acknowledged both the darkness and light within consciousness, the capacity for both destruction and creation, both hatred and love, both despair and hope that characterize the full spectrum of human possibility, rather than representing competing worldviews that must eliminate each other through philosophical warfare, rather than synthesis and mutual understanding. And so we conclude our journey through the twisted corridors of Mahito's philosophy, having witnessed how hatred born from humanity's darkest impulses creates its own form of tragic blindness. His existence serves not as validation of human evil, but as warning about the dangers of viewing ourselves through the lens of our worst moments alone. The cursed spirit who embodied our shadow showed us what we might become if we surrender to despair and embrace only the darkness within our hearts. Yet in his defeat, we glimpse hope that awareness of our capacity for evil need not define us, that acknowledging our shadows can lead to growth rather than destruction. As you drift towards sleep, remember that the monsters we create through our hatred and fear are real, but so too is our capacity for love, growth, and redemption. The choice between becoming Mahito or transcending him remains ours to make each day. Rest now, knowing that even in darkness, the potential for light endures within the human heart.